While connected technology is essential for unlocking new efficiencies on the production floor, it's also presented hackers with new opportunities to steal valuable IP and data. To support OT professionals in their battle with cyber criminals, we launched the Security Breach podcast. In each of our over 100 episodes, we've brought in cybersecurity specialists to provide valuable insights and break down critical topics. As a go-to podcast for our listeners, we want to help you align your brand with our expertise. By sponsoring our podcast, your brand will build trust, and your message will stand out to an audience searching for tools to assist their cybersecurity efforts. Secure your share in this rapidly growing segment by sponsoring Security Breach. Contact us today to learn more. Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Regardless of the situation or dynamic, everyone likes to think that they're special in some way, shape, or form, and that's fine. However, with experience, we learn that appreciating both the shared similarities as well as some of those unique traits are how we can best solve problems. A great example is a recent conversation I had with Umame Khan, founder and CEO of Opal Security. She goes by UK for short, and her firm focuses on the identity management sector of cybersecurity. This is a topic that is, or should be, at the top of your OT cybersecurity checklist. What UK constantly reinforced is that the industrial sector is not alone in trying to figure out the best ways to manage and secure human, equipment, and asset identification. So while some of the application challenges are unique for each industry, there's a lot of good and bad strategies to draw from in determining what might be best for your enterprise. So, with that in mind, let's dive into a conversation that encompassed a wide range of topics, including agentic AI, identity management, and why the future of industrial cybersecurity will be more about what humans can or cannot do, as opposed to the technology they manage. So, UK, thanks so much for joining us today on Security Breach. We're going to dive into a bunch of different stuff, but I know one of the areas that you really focus on with Opal Security is identity management. This is something in the industrial sector we're just really getting a firmer hold onto and starting the conversation. So maybe you can start off by just telling us some of the bigger challenges that you've seen folks struggling with when it comes to this whole process of identity management.
Yeah, so I think to level set, because identity management itself can be a little bit of like a vague term. What we're really talking about here is identity and access management, so access control. Um, you know, and this is not specific to the industrial sector, but across the board, the hardest challenges are actually the basics. Fragmentation is number one. So a total lack of visibility into what identities in a workforce have access to what assets, digital or otherwise. A lack of granularity, like what are they actually able to do if they can access those assets? A system of record. So you often have multiple sources of truth that aren't kept up to date. And some sort of ability to do consistent change management. So as things are in flux, both on the identity side and the access or on the asset side, being able to kind of manage that across the board in a consistent sort of scalable way.
No, all interesting challenges, I'm sure. Is there, when you look at some of these, is there one that you stick out that you're addressing more frequently than others, things that really seem to come to the forefront?
Yeah. So, I like to start with that because it almost sounds so obvious and the reality is it's quite difficult to do. If I were to take a step back, the number one challenge we address kind of is what I like to call systems engineering in the identity sector. And what that means is the reason you can't do any of these things is because there's no sort of native infrastructure built to account for the fact that you cannot track at any point in time who has access to what and at what level. And I think that's sort of like our sort of prerequisite, call it, right? An ability to actually discover assets, discover who exists within your organization, human or otherwise, full-time or otherwise, and then be able to sort of start to consistently apply that change management across the board.
On the surface, this seems pretty straightforward, right? You do a very clear asset management or asset inventory study. You understand everything you've got and who's got access to it. What are some of the factors that you see? And we know this gets complicated, but what are some of the biggest things that you see that just continue to make this such a tough and complex issue?
Yeah. So first off, it's deceptively simple. Like you would think,
Yeah.
like, why this seems okay. But one thing people often don't sort of realize until they kind of scratch the surface or have lived it is identity in particular is people, process, and technology. It is really, really difficult to keep track of all of those vectors in a consistent and real-time format. You know, um, people, I mean, just keeping track of who in an organization like exists at
Yeah.
what level and what's happening, that's something that's just like not done well across the board in any industry. In
Yeah.
fact, I would argue, I came from a defense background, and the only real way you have of managing that is through security clearances, right?
Yeah.
Like, who are you? Like, what should you have a level of clearance for, and what should you be? And even then, the context and sort of the cost of getting that up and running is
Yeah.
massive, right? And so and this is because you have sort of these like different incentives. If you think about it, if you're growing a business in any sector, especially in private sector, right? That takes precedence over necessarily thinking about risk posture. You need to develop, you need to build, you need to get going, you need to capture market share. And so oftentimes the people side of the house, the human identity management side of the house is sort of it's primarily controlled by IT, which has sort of this like edict to like productivity at all costs. And so what happens is the compelling events to think about identity management are actually tied to growth of business, aka bringing on more people. And so things sort of happen in this ad hoc way. You start bringing in parts of the stack for access, primarily to give more access to more things, as opposed to think about it from a risk layer. And then on the asset side of the house, that's generally just sort of controlled by different departments and different organizations. Once upon a time, when we build businesses, it was very regimented. You'd have front of house, you'd have back of house. What your role was would basically stay the same throughout the entirety of your career. And you could sort of codify that based on what your role was actually. And that just doesn't happen anymore. So you're actually dealing with this a ton of like tribal knowledge when you think about doing intelligence at this layer. And so if you take a step back, parameterizing all of that, keeping in line with it, and then also making it dynamic and future-proofed, because people's jobs do change even in the course of an organization, or whether an asset is sensitive changes in the course of prototyping, becomes becomes a very complex problem to think about from a system standpoint.
Absolutely. So one of the things we talk about in manufacturing a lot is we still have IT and OT working in silos. They don't get together enough and discuss a lot of things from a security perspective within OT technologies.
Yeah.
What it feels like you're discussing is not only do we have those folks working in silos, but we've also got this HR dynamic that's also not being brought into the fold. It's almost a perfect storm of non-communication going on. Is that essentially what we're dealing with in a lot of cases when it comes to
Yeah.
really getting this going?
Yeah, so if we take a step back, those silos, it's great you call that out. It's sort of the core of the issue. And I would actually argue that some of that is by design historically,
Yeah.
and that there was a lot of security through obscurity at this layer because, oftentimes like and right now just in the broader market, like, if you talk to any chief security officer in any sector, they'll tell you identity is like their number one attack surface. And part of that is because the way we used to design these systems was in silos. We'd have shadow tenants and shadow IT, or we'd silo off our critical systems and have them owned by those departments who had the most context. It was a way of guaranteeing at least some level of control and granularity, right? Now, what's happened since is the rate at which businesses pivot, move, change their strategies means that these things get affected and they're actually more of a risk than a security layer. And so, you brought up a great example with things like IT being siloed off from OT. What we've seen is, increasingly you have sort of interconnectivity with IoT edge platforms, for example, right? And these things the control planes are often in the cloud. And, oftentimes these things are adopted, even in the industrial sector, to try and, consolidate things forward, prototype more quickly. But now you have another attack vector. The good thing is like, because these things actually operate in the same way any other cloud application does, you can bring IAM controls in. And so I don't actually think that it's that like unique of a challenge specific to the industrial sector. It's actually a lot of the same habits that we've spread across the board. The other sort of component I would call out here is that oftentimes um, in manufacturing, you do work with a lot of third-party vendors that can remote into your systems, and there's absolutely no visibility into what they actually fully at depth have the ability to do. You're sort of working off of assumptions that may or may not be correct in terms of access. And so part-time contracting, offshore teams, like remote contractors, all of that, some of that information may be in the HR system, but more often than not, it's not. And so there's
Yeah.
like this real need to actually double down on that control plane, on that interconnectivity, and build IAM systems that are in line with that.
We'll be back after a quick break.
If you spend way too much time online, first of all, same. And second, you need promo guide talk pills. I'm Rawal, and with Alex, we break down everything happening in tech, digital marketing, and the internet's latest chaos. No boring corporate talk, just real discussions with real opinions. So go on, press play. You know you want to.
No, you hit the nail on the head with a really critical issue in the industrial sector, which is that visibility. We struggle with that a great deal, and it leads to a lot of kind of fluctuating or non-concrete asset management practices as well. If we're bringing new stuff in, we know it's there. Why does everybody else need to know about it? What have been some solutions or some best practices that you might be able to offer in terms of improving that visibility and as a byproduct, improving the asset management approaches, which ideally will help us with identity management as well? It feels like it all bleeds together pretty quickly.
It does. And, I'd say step one is we're a little bit of in a prison of our own making because in some
Yeah.
sense we haven't quite fully accepted or embraced the chaos. I think people who have to manage identity systems can sometimes be in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation where they're still hoping for that silver bullet that will come in and clean up everything. And the reality is these are systems that are so integral to businesses running that there's never going to be a stop the world moment where you can rip everything out and get going. So to your point, you're going to keep adding assets and you're going to keep sort of the processes you already have in place are going to continue to happen. Anything you do isn't disruptive. And so like, the way we think about it is, well, what do we do in other parts of the software stack when we deal with like systems that are already running, right? When we have to kind of like be migration friendly, et cetera. And so bringing those types of paradigms into place. So for example, service discovery, right? Being able to actually utilize the fact you have cloud platforms that are managing some of these assets. For us at Opal, we've also kind of like taken the approach of having deployment flexibility. So being able to sit on premise or in air-gapped environments so that we can directly connect into those systems if needed, right? As some folks have taken the approach of actually having like physical agents that sit with hardware. There's a lot of optionality, but like where you want to start is like just to sort of accepting the world's not going to stop, right? So
Yeah.
so if the world's not going to stop and you still need to figure out everything that's going on, like design systems that can actually bring that visibility and depth and sit on top of what you already have in place as opposed to stop the world, rip it out, start
Yeah.
from scratch, because that's just not how businesses work at the end of the day.
Yeah. So we know that there's been a lot of ways to exploit poor identity management practices. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that because we know we need to set priorities. We know we can't do it all at once, but we need to start some places. Otherwise, the bad guys are going to understand how to take advantage of it. So maybe you can offer a little perspective there.
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think one of the reasons this keeps chief security officers up at night is because it is a well-known attack surface, and the
Yeah.
obscurity sometimes feels like the only thing keeping it like running as is. I hate to say it, but it's very much a matter of like when, not if, when it comes to like identity compromise. Um, some of the things we see, even with organizations we work with, is insider threat is increasingly becoming an issue in regulated environments. So places like manufacturing, defense, healthcare, fintech. Because businesses are growing at a rapid rate, because they have remote teams, even post-pandemic, a lot of folks ended up in hybrid workforces. The ability for even a nation state actor like to come in, impersonate a full-time employee and actually go through completely above board channels like HR, et cetera, and just have access to keys to the kingdom is becoming increasingly common. And what this means is that, we have to design access control systems that actually do anomaly detection, right? And do actually connect those silos, to your point. Like if we see somebody coming in at the HR and in the HR system, and we see that they're a contractor, actually being able to clean up and be able to clearly define what contractors have access to across the board becomes even more important. Those guardrails become even more important. This seemed almost like sci-fi, like maybe a couple of years ago, but the reality is it absolutely happens, and it absolutely happens in these industries, like constantly, actually. And even sort of with the broader landscape, we're still going to outsource manufacturing. For example, Apple is still going to have factories in India. We're still going to have remote contractors, like part-time employees in the States. And so being able to codify and set scalable guardrails for those third-party identities becomes increasingly important. The second thing we're seeing sort of is automation, obviously, is the name of the game. People are thinking about agentic security. They're thinking about what agents can actually do. And as those technologies take on broader and broader scope, the threat model meaningfully changes, right? What an agent or a non-human identity or a machine identity can do in the span of 30 minutes, even on accident, is far more damaging in scope than what a human would potentially do with a misconfiguration. When we even think about the principle of least privilege, which is something like at Opal we focus pretty deeply on, giving a human access to something for a day is considered fairly safe, even in a mission critical system. It just takes 30 minutes, right, at max, for like you to for you to be in like in a massive SEV if a machine ID is doing lateral movement. Like the moment it's given its scope of access to another ID, you've kind of like lost the delegation path. So these are sort of emerging, there's kind of the human side of things. It's going to continue to be messy. And then we have this like new entire like threat model on automation that's emerging. And it pushes this risk management layer further and further up the stack to the identity level, basically. And, the good news is we're in a position to kind of take a step back and look at the strategies we have available to us, like MFA, various like authentication protocols, various authorization protocols, and start to patch and apply them from the get-go. In manufacturing, we have a lot of protocols and regulation around how we do safety in various parts of the business. Like this is an opportunity for folks to think about bringing some of those types of protocols and taking them seriously on the identity side as well, right?
Yeah, I mean that's a challenge, and I wouldn't even say it's not that it's taking seriously. It's just it's not a priority. When you're looking at a manufacturing facility, we need to get product out the door. Yeah, we want to keep everything safe and secure. We don't want to give the bad guys an open door, but it just doesn't get the level of priority again that we'd like it to. And I think some of that from an identity perspective is we still don't know. Again, going back to the whole visibility thing, we don't know everything we've got. We don't even have identities for some of these endpoints and some of these machines right now.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Should I be excited or afraid of AI? The answer is yes, it's both.
Things are going to look so different in the next couple years. You will not be ready for the disruptions that are going to come.
I'm Jeff Nielsen, host of Digital Disruption, the go-to podcast for technology leaders.
Our generation's conflict, I think, is going to be emotional, not economic.
The companies that are going to win are the ones that have a couple of characteristics.
Stay ahead of the curve with Digital Disruption, available now on your favorite podcast platform.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tale as old as time. And I think identity is very unique in this regard because it starts as a productivity issue, and then by the time you realize it's a security issue, you're already a massive business, basically, right? We often see that it's it's a compromise is imminent or about to happen or has happened that makes people sort of like hit the brakes and think, okay, we have to rethink the perimeter here. But that's that's not a manufacturing specific issue. It's actually true across the board, across the entire enterprise. And I would say that with things rapid, the rapid technological innovation, the technological shifts happening right now, it's an inflection point. It's actually an opportunity to take a step back and say, well, we need to rethink how we build these types of systems from the ground up and build them with more sophistication. It's doable, is what I'd say, and it's and the thing about security is oftentimes you see those big paradigm shifts happen in line with technological shifts. So, when network took off, we had firewalls, right? When we moved from data centers to the cloud. Though that's an interesting one, by the way, because we're moving back to data centers. We're moving back to actually having on-prem hardware, which is interesting because that's part of what's putting the onus on identity security again, identity and data as opposed to network and endpoint.
You're right. That's a great point. Everything is cyclical at times. The more we evolve, the more we kind of backtrack once in a while.
Yeah, it's about getting back to the basics. Like this is fundamentals, and it's one of these like weird dirty secrets, right? Like it's shocking how many of these types of issues occur. Like I don't know if you saw, like for instance, SolarWinds was sued by the SEC for lack of good access control. So actually, it becomes a securities issue, like at the public level as well, right? Because this is regulation, pure and simple. Like imagine not following safety protocols in a manufacturing environment. That is business risk, right? And so we're starting to see some of those trends converge, especially in heavily regulated environments.
Well, especially when there's profitability and a lot of these attacks and things can impact that profitability. We're definitely seeing folks like the SEC get involved and want to know more about what's going on, and also know how it's going to be fixed. So it's an interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, I mean, that second point is so key, right? We went through a very similar maturity curve, I would say, with the observability space about 5 years ago, where once upon a time you understood that systems going down was a business risk, but there wasn't a ton of clarity into how we moved forward and how we handled outages. And we were sort of able to kind of get that under control by bringing that visibility, by bringing that remediation, and being able to have postmortems that said, here's the path forward in case something happens, right? This is incident response. You're never going to be in a situation where you can fully guarantee there's no risk in an organization. It's just a fact, but we can build better protocols around this. And, to me, that's, part of the reason why security built this is like, there's no better signal that something is needed than to be able to kind of tie it to like being able to show business health or business risk and go forward. Sorry, pausing there. I don't know if that made sense. But...
No, yeah, absolutely. No, we're tracking. One of the things that's interesting too, when we talk about some of these risks, a lot of it's already on the plant floor. When we look at a lot of legacy equipment, legacy networking configurations for the OT environment, and then we're bringing a lot of these Industry 4.0 technologies and hooking them up and connecting them, not thinking as much about the security risk between them, not always even identifying them appropriately. I guess, what are some of the things that you're seeing there from both a risk perspective and then a solution perspective as well in combining the legacy with the new stuff?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say I say this often. You can't boil the ocean in project as complex, strategic, and dynamic as identity. You just can't. You can't come in with the mindset that you're going to wave a magic wand and it's all going to be fixed. Like this is by nature a deeply strategic process. And what that means is kind of going back to the idea of being migration friendly first. If you work from the assumption that you're in a mixed estate. You've got legacy systems, you've got new stuff, you've got, folks bringing in their cool new AI technologies. Step one is to stop and think about what are your most critical assets, and where do your most critical assets live. Often we find that the control plane in the cloud is a critical asset. So starting with like visibility into cloud assets or cloud providers is huge, right? It gives you sort of, and it's an easy win because systems that are built for modern technology stacks oftentimes have like the right endpoints to go deep, like us. And so thinking about that 80-20 rule, that's what we encourage actually with everyone we work with. Every organization, once it's sufficiently mature and a sufficiently regulated environment, can tell you off the top of their head what are their 10 most critical assets, if that, right? And the ones that keep them up at night. And so starting with those, and then over time, sort of planning out what other systems kind of can mature and be brought in under this like sort of visibility plane and orchestration plane. And so, maybe legacy systems today don't have those connectors, but over time, as you sort of like feel like you've got the most critical systems under control, you can start to figure out how to build the connectors into the platform. For us, that's how we handle it. We offer a lot of flexibility in figuring out how to like onboard those legacy systems. And it's nice because it kind of gives you sort of peace of mind you're making progress towards the outcome. And whatever new stuff is coming on, is also sort of like you can think of it as greenfield. You can kind of set the controls to say, this is a prerequisite before we bring this technology in. It has to sit in this, right? And so just being strategic about that's something we spend a lot of time with our customers, for example, like just mapping that out. And it works pretty well. It's not a one-shot thing, but it starts to make progress.
Well, I think the key there, one of the things you kind of mentioned is it's a strategy, but it is a mindset. It's about we have to take that extra pause or that extra step when we implement this or integrate this new technology to make sure everything hooks up correctly. And that is a tough mindset to get into when you've operated for years and years without that approach.
Yeah. What I'll say there is that that mindset and that bias, I think a lot of folks have some level of PTSD from incorporating services.
Yeah.
Oftentimes these things are quite frictionful. Security has sort of the unfortunate role to play as general counsel, almost like within like engineering orgs oftentimes, right? Yeah. And one of the things we really focus on is like it doesn't have to be that way. It can actually be sufficiently native and frictionless such that people are incentivized to bring these systems in. I can give you sort of an example I like to use from the software side of the house, which is, GitHub is a compliance tool. Nobody is compelling you to use GitHub in most organizations. And, most engineers are not told they have to, use GitHub. And, if you are truly, truly out there, you could possibly get away with emailing your code to your coworker. And Git as version of control exists independent of GitHub. But nobody's going to do that because it would actually slow the business down. It would actually be more friction and sort of like there's an initial hump to get over when we think about bringing in security practices. But once the foundation is laid out, it should feel a little bit more like that, where anyone would be insane to not use what is effectively a system of record and a compliance tool to actually do their jobs.
Interesting perspective. One of the things I like that you keep bringing up is manufacturing is not the only one, or they're not unique for a lot of these situations. And I think what that helps illustrate is there are solutions out there. We're not alone. Everybody has gone through this process or these challenges. So there's the solutions out there. Teeing it up a little bit, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about Opal Security and some of the things that you guys are up to.
Yeah. I just to emphasize that point, Jeff. Yeah, not alone out there in industry. Everyone from Fortune 500 to government to even fast growing startups, everyone has a lot of these issues on silos, fragmentation, legacy hardware. And it's very it's a very delicate operation to touch, like in especially like even Fortune 500, those identity veins, like especially if they're on-prem identity systems from the past legacy stacks, they run very deep, and people are loath to like, do any sort of like open heart surgery on them. And so like that's sort of where we come in. Part of the reason we designed this product and we have this vision is the realization that every time somebody has approached this problem, it's always come from the perspective of ripping out everything that exists and starting greenfield. But that's kind of how we ended up where we did in the first place, right? And so almost coming in at that like supervisor level, being able to go deep and pull the data from everywhere it exists, right? And then start to synthesize and normalize it. So that's really what Opal does. It creates that data layer of who has access to what at a very, very deep level. It's easy to say, it's very, very hard to do, right? From an engineering standpoint. And then more importantly, make it as real time and continuous as possible. So this is something I often highlight also, because a lot of legacy identity systems were built at a time where humans managed access primarily, and the systems didn't actually change that much, right? These systems work at a time scale that is nothing like any other modern software. They are not continuous, they are not real time, they are not event driven. And so by building that layer, we have the ability to kind of become the system of record, to become the orchestration plane. And so that's like what we really emphasize. And then what that allows is actually start to tackle remediation and risk. And so when we talk about the principle of least privilege, oftentimes people think that means no access to anything, or strictly decreasing access, but it's actually the right access at the right time, at the right place. It's very similar to having a security clearance, right? And to do that, you need all of that data in real time so that you can actually synthesize it and start to use things like classic ML as well as AI to start to give those recommendations on how to auto scale that access. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say the continuous in real time thing, I don't think that can be understated, because as a feature and functionality, that's something the hackers are going to take advantage of. That's something the bad guys are counting on in a lot of instances to leverage in doing what they're going to do.
Oh, absolutely. There was like, I'm reminded also there was another big thing in the press like at the end of last year where hackers had sat on an identity vendor in the US Treasury's stack for almost a year, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not just that they can take advantage of it because it moves so slowly and it's not real time. You can lay in wait for a really, really long time because nobody actually knows who has access to what. And that's really terrifying if you think about it, right? And we're seeing more of those types of evolutions of attacks, right? And attackers aren't just going after like wide scale phishing and social, like they're actually being a little bit more methodical and figuring out where crown jewels are and waiting, right? And then if you throw on agents that are red teaming, that's even more aggressive on how quickly they can gather the context on what your crown jewels are and go after those things. And so one of the things that we do is, that's why I remember when we started the company, it was considered a little bit old school, but like we built for on-prem and we built for sort of like secured environments like air gap, because you need to be able to meet industries more than halfway when you're sort of offering these types of orchestration systems. Yeah.
Well, especially when you look at critical infrastructure, there's a lot of utilities, whether it's water treatment, power, whatever, especially in smaller municipalities where, man, they can use all the help they can get because they are as old school as they can get, not even by choice, just by the resources allocated to them. They don't have the opportunity to do a lot more than air gap. I mean, that can be the biggest security measure they can take sometimes.
Yeah. And to your point, this is really about empowering people to understand what is going on in their own organizations, right? This isn't another toy that will show you like 16 different vulnerabilities. No, and that's why I come back to the fundamentals. It's terrifying to think about the fact that we don't always have full clarity, even in these very critical systems we're running, and what is going on, right?
100%. Couldn't agree more. UK, I want to circle back to something that we started talking about a little bit, and that's remote access. It's such a big part of the industrial sector, being able to look at things either from home or wherever, monitoring different levels, keeping track of inventory, whatever the case may be. And as a result, industrial sector has not always been great at taking the extra step, even if it's multi-factor or whatever the case is, in securing those connection points. What are some of the things that you've seen in terms of best practices? Do we need to go to zero trust right away all the time? Because that's hard for manufacturers to really grab onto. So what's your take, I guess, on that?
Jeff, first, I wouldn't beat ourselves up about this, because when we think about culturally the way a lot of these industries work, like in manufacturing, a lot of these relationships with vendors, for example, are built on trust. We buy from trusted vendors, and we do that because we know that these jobs are wide and complex and deep, and ultimately, like, we need to sort of give that broad access if we don't have any better controls. And so, it's not for negligence. It's because that's just how business gets done when you manufacture at scale, right? Or manage like critical, like, power systems, et cetera, at scale. People buy from people at the end of the day. Now, as the world has changed, as things have shifted, as we are moving more things onshore again, right? And we're sort of scaling things up, it can be tough to vet everything. And so one best practice is making sure that those even human identities are accounted for within your workforce systems. Now, the tough part is HR systems are often not owned by, nor should be owned by, security or engineering teams, right? And that's why we sit on top of those systems, because that way we can actually ingest and clean up that layer and at least offer a system of record that's more programmatic. That's something that can actually be that information can be utilized by engineering or security teams that are building threat detection, et cetera, right? So ingesting that data. But by having this orchestration layer, it can actually encourage that we set those things in place from the get-go, as opposed to just relying on that trust that we know these vendors, and we can just bring them in. So that's a big one. And then the second thing on the trust piece is you can kind of have that, again, those principle of least privilege paradigms. So one that's very valuable is what we like to call, like, use it or lose it, right? So we can track if people are sort of set up and ingested correctly, or identities are set up and ingested correctly, we can sort of track, hey, this person hasn't actually touched any of these critical systems for 60 days. We probably don't want them to have that access, and revoke it immediately, for example. That's a very basic example, sort of some of the proactive hygiene that can be done. And so just having a system that can actually, like, capture all of that information and allow security teams to proactively take steps, so you're constantly maintaining posture, gets you to a state where maybe zero trust will make sense in some critical systems, but even just knowing you're doing that kind of pruning of things that are out in the wild is very helpful. And then the last thing I'll say there is, by bringing in those other sort of like non-full-time identities into an orchestration plane like Opal, you have the ability to do more sophisticated anomaly detection, right? You can start to see the patterns and start to see the best practices that one should be giving access or revoking access with, in terms of contractors or remote employees versus what a full-time employee would get. And so being able to leverage, like, very classic, like, fraud detection algorithms even are very powerful if you have all of that information.
Well, that pruning or use it or lose it approach, I can think of 3 or 4 high-level hacks that got a lot of attention and cost companies a lot of money that could have been avoided with that type of approach. That's interesting. UK, this has been awesome. Great conversation. Really appreciate the time again. Wrapping things up here a little bit, what do you see as some of the bigger trends, whether it's specific to identity management or bigger picture when it comes to cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is we're going to see more and more things move into supply chain. Like, even traditional IT pillars like identity are more and more inline, real time, as we discussed. So thinking about, like, the full supply chain attack surface becomes bigger, and it becomes a bigger and bigger issue, right? And thinking about all systems in security, like engineering systems, right? And making them real time, continuous, et cetera. The other obvious one is, like, we touched on this, agentic systems. They just have very, very different threat models, like a way an agent gathers context, gathers data, even how it would potentially provision access to a system or manage that system, right? it's not today, it's still legible to a human, and very quickly it will probably not be, right? And so being able to think about those non-human identities in an IAM stack that works for humans is actually really, really important, because the reality is, as much as we want to, we're not going to be smart enough to keep up. It's it's
Yeah.
it's a fact. It's a fact. And what this
Mhm.
means is, like, we come back to, like, it's the way I think about it almost is like, we're going to be building the equivalent of hard tech software. Like, it has to be software that
Wow.
effectively runs
Yeah.
like with that level of precision. And we see this sometimes, like with real-time operating systems or navigation systems, et cetera. Security has to operate like that, because in a world that you can't guarantee what happens the moment an agent is out there after they're like it's given more access to another agent, right? Like,
Yeah. No, that's a great point.
it's back
Absolutely.
to guardrails, right? And those guardrails have to not just be human legible; they actually have to work at scale. So, I love the fact that we're thinking about this from a manufacturing standpoint, because in some sense, like, any industry that has gone through industrialization has already had to think about these things.
Yeah.
And what's happening right now is software is going through industrialization. It has never gone through industrialization. So we've never built the regulation, the protocols, the best practices in
Yeah.
the way we do at the factory level. Factories are designed to accommodate the load of other machines outputting at a speed that it has nothing to do with how quickly a human works. We have humans in the loop at certain critical points, but when we
Yeah.
think about how we scale, it's all industrialized. And so that's kind of how I think about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's a great point. I mean, when you look at the medical, space, that's definitely the case in terms
Yeah.
of how they've ramped up security with all the different machinery and different ways data can be stolen.
Yeah.
That's definitely played a big part in what they're doing from a security perspective. So that makes a lot of sense. It's a great
Yeah.
analogy.
I mean, the medical industry had to learn the hard way also, not just on the data breach level. And this is a little bit like out there, but like there's like a very classic case where like somebody uh it's an old case, like where the level of radiation was like incorrectly programmed into like radiation machines, and they delivered like thousands of times the dose they were supposed to. And we learned these lessons the hard way in those types of industries. But even from like that precision, putting the precision aside, it's the hyperscale, right? Like we're entering a point where we're entering potentially hyperscale in software development, right? And so what we build to put the guardrails in place for software development, including in security, now start to take a different approach and a different philosophy. And I think the first place we're going to start to see that meaningfully is actually security, because almost all security software today is designed to accommodate what humans can or can't do, not what machines can or can't do.
Well said. That's great. I mean, we talk about the human factor in cybersecurity so frequently, but to put it in that perspective, great way to wrap things up. UK, thank you so much for the time. Really appreciate the conversation here today.
Likewise, Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, UK. And to learn more about the company, you can check them out at opal.dev. And thank you for joining us. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore on Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@IEN.com. For UK, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.